Latino America is a continent shaped by revolution. Some succeeded, some collapsed, some dissolved into memory, some came back with new faces. But when you follow the story carefully, from the Mexican Revolution in 1910 all the way to the presidency of Nayib Bukele today, you start to notice something more profound. A revolution is never an isolated incident. It is part of a historical continuum. From the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to the Spanish Civil War, from Guatemala in 1954 to Chile in 1988, each upheaval is linked to the next by what came before it and by what is to come. This is the story of that continuum, a century-long conversation between hope and disillusionment, between empire and resistance, of a future that refuses to be settled. The first great rupture comes in 1910. Mexico explodes after decades of authoritarian rule under Porfirio Diaz, a regime built on foreign capital, railroad expansion, and deepening inequality. But what makes the Mexican Revolution different is who led it. Peasants, indigenous communities, campesinos who had been dispossessed of their land for generations. Emiliano Zapata's cry, Tierra y Libertad, becomes more than a slogan. It becomes the moral foundation of Latin American rebellion. For the first time on the continent, the poor are not just participating in history, they are writing it. The revolution becomes a model not because Mexico solved all of its problems, but because it proved something radical, that people can rise. In 1936, another conflict erupts, this time across the ocean, in Spain. But for Latin America, the Spanish Civil War is not foreign. Hundreds of Latin Americans enlist and go fight in the international brigades, fighting fascism under the banner of the Republic. Mexicans, Cubans, Argentines, Chileans, and Guatemalans join the fight. Some die in Madrid, some return home forever changed. For them, Spain becomes kind of a laboratory of revolution, a place where the stakes are both existential and ideological. The defeat of the Republic sends a clear message. If fascism can win in Europe, it can win anywhere. If the left can lose there, it can lose here. The Spanish Civil War becomes a training ground and a warning for the revolutionary generation to come. If there is one figure that embodies the tragedy and the promise of Latin American revolution, is Jacobo Árbenz. Elected president of Guatemala in 1950, Arbenz is not, and I can't emphasize this enough, a communist. He is a modernizing nationalist who wants to reduce inequality and build a self-sufficient country. But his land reforms, especially the expropriation of unused land belonging to the United Fruit Company, threaten US corporate power. In 1954, the CIA orchestrates a coup d'etat, overthrowing Arbenz and installing a military dictatorship. This moment is pivotal because it reveals a brutal continental truth. In Latino America, the boundaries between reform and revolution is not marked by intention, but by who feels threatened. Arbenz radicalizes a generation, among them a young Argentine doctor named Ernesto Che Guevara, who witnessed the coup firsthand and concludes, peaceful revolution is impossible.
Patria o muerte.
Five years later, the Cuban Revolution succeeds. Fidel Castro, Camilo Cienfuegos, Che Guevara, and the 26th of July movement overthrow Batista, the US-backed dictator. For the first time in Latin American history, a socialist revolution triumphs and consolidates power. Education and health improve dramatically. Land is redistributed. A new sense of dignity is born. But the revolution becomes authoritarian. Dissent is suppressed. Political pluralism disappears. Still, Cuba transforms the continent. It proves that revolution is not a fantasy, it is a possibility. And with that, the guerrilla era begins. From the 1960s to the 1990s, guerrilla movements exploded across Latin America. FARC and ELN in Colombia, Sendero Luminoso in Peru, MIR in Chile, Montoneros in Argentina, URNG in Guatemala, Sandinistas in Nicaragua, National Liberation Front in El Salvador. Some fight dictatorships, some fight oligarchies, some embrace Marxism, some become tragically violent. This era is not just shaped by local inequalities, but by the Cold War. The United States, terrified of another Cuba, supports paramilitaries, military juntas, counterinsurgency operations.
If we do not act promptly and decisively in defense of freedom, new Cubas will arise from the ruins of today's conflicts.
Operation Condor, coordinated among Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, leads to tens of thousands of disappearances. In Central America, the violence is catastrophic. In Guatemala, a 36-year civil war marked by systematic state terror, a genocide against Maya communities under Efraín Ríos Montt. In El Salvador, a 12-year civil war, death squads, Archbishop Romero assassinated at Mass, children forced into militias. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas overthrow Somoza, only to face a US-funded Contra war. Revolution becomes intertwined with massacre. Utopia becomes entangled with terror. But despite the horror, one thing becomes clear. Latin America is not passive. It is fighting again and again for autonomy. By the 1980s and 1990s, the revolutionary left is worn down. Guerrillas demobilize, peace treaties are signed, dictatorships transition to democracy, neoliberal policies spread, privatizations, deregulation, austerity. The Washington consensus becomes dominant. The dream of revolution collapses. The dream of prosperity also collapses. Millions fall into poverty. The state retreats from social welfare. Violence rather than ideology becomes the new language of power. But Latino America is not done with revolution. It is preparing for a new one.
God damn it! Viva la revolución!
Beginning in the early 2000s, a wave of left-leaning governments named for their pink or not fully red break from traditional socialism, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula da Silva in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Kirchnerism in Argentina, Tabaré Vázquez and Pepe Mujica in Uruguay. This is not guerrilla revolution. It is democratic socialism built through elections. Oil wealth funds social programs. Poverty drops dramatically. Indigenous movements gain political rights, especially in Bolivia. But the pink tide faces contradictions. Venezuela descends into institutional crisis and economic collapse. Corruption scandals shake governments across the region, and dependence on high commodity prices exposes deep structural vulnerabilities. Yet, despite its contradictions, the pink tide marks a turning point, proof that, after decades of neoliberal dominance, mass popular movements could once again reshape the political landscape. A continent attempting justice without war. In the 1980s, El Salvador and Guatemala are engulfed in brutal civil conflicts, conflicts fueled by Cold War geopolitics, fueled by US interventions and local inequality. When thousands of people flee to Los Angeles, they enter a world of alienation, poverty, and policing. Here, in the margins of the city, MS-13 and Barrio 18 emerge, not as imported Latin threats, but as survival structures built by displaced teenagers navigating violence on both sides of the border. The conflict deepens when the US begins mass deportations in the 1990s. Gang members are sent back to countries still recovering from civil war. Weak states, militarized police, and devastated communities become the perfect soil for a new cycle of violence, one not driven by ideology, but by fragmentation, trauma, and exclusion. The maras are not a cause, they're a consequence of civil wars that uprooted families, a consequence of economies shattered by neoliberal reforms, of deportation policies that exported urban violence, of states that reconstruct democracy but not opportunity. And then comes the present.
Literalmente pasamos de ser el país más inseguro del mundo a ser el país más seguro de todo el hemisferio occidental. El país más seguro de todo el continente americano. ¿Y qué dijeron? Está violando derechos humanos. ¿Los derechos humanos de quién? ¿De la gente honrada? No. Tal vez pusimos prioridad en los derechos de la gente honrada sobre los derechos de los delincuentes. Eso es lo único que hemos hecho. Y lo que ustedes a eso le llaman violar derechos humanos. Yo les pregunto a estos organismos, a estos gobiernos de naciones extranjeras, le pregunto a estos periodistas, ¿por qué desean que nos maten? ¿Por qué desean ver sangre de salvadoreños? ¿Por qué no están felices de que en nuestro país ya no corre la sangre que corría antes? ¿Por qué debemos morir nosotros y nuestros hijos para que ustedes estén contentos que estamos respetando su falsa democracia, que ni ustedes mismos respeten en sus propios países?
El Salvador, once home of the Revolutionary Liberation Front, elects Nayib Bukele, a millennial president who frames himself as both anti-establishment and post-ideological. He crushes the power of gangs with mass incarceration, building one of the largest prisons in the world. He weakens democratic institutions. He centralizes power. Millions adore him. Bukele is not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. He is a response to the failure of revolution, a response to corruption, violence, poverty, and political stagnation. He is the first truly post-Cold War Latin American strongman, blending authoritarianism with digital aesthetics, memes, surveillance technology, and hyper-efficient spectacle, where the revolution once sought land and later sought equality. Bukele offers something else: order. So what is left after a century of rebellion? From Zapata's horses to Bukele's mega prison, from the trenches in Madrid to the jungles in Guatemala, from Che Guevara's notebooks to the empty supermarkets in Caracas, from the dream of collective liberation to the promise of algorithmic security. Latin America has tried every possible path: uprising, reform, guerrilla, democracy, socialism, neoliberalism, and now techno-authoritarian populism. If there is a conclusion, it is this: Latin American revolutions have never been about ideology. They have always been about dignity. Every generation has attempted, in its own way, to reclaim it. And perhaps that is the real revolution. Not a single moment, but a relentless refusal to accept a world written by someone else.